On April 24, 1913, a man who'd grown up shoveling cow manure on a farm in upstate New York pressed no button and gave no speech. He simply watched from the sidewalk on Broadway as President Woodrow Wilson, seated in the White House 6 states away, triggered a telegraph signal that lit 80,000 electric bulbs at once. The Woolworth building, 792 feet of white terracotta and Gothic tracery, blazed against the Manhattan sky like a cathedral on fire. Frank Winfield Woolworth had paid for every inch of it in cash. $13.5 million. No mortgage, no bonds, no loan of any kind. The tallest structure on the face of the earth, and he owned it the way you own a pair of shoes. 66 years later, his granddaughter Barbara Hutton died in a suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Her bank account held roughly $3,500. 16 people came to the funeral. The family name is still cut into the facade at 233 Broadway. You can walk past it any morning, watch the light catch those carved letters, and know that nobody named Woolworth has had anything to do with the building in decades. The name remains, though the money and the people are long gone. And the question that keeps the story from being just another cautionary tale about inherited wealth is this: how does a fortune built on nickels and dimes, on the relentless multiplication of small transactions across 1,000 storefronts, evaporate so completely that 3 generations later there isn't enough left to cover a month's rent? The answer isn't gambling, and it isn't a market crash or a swindle, though all of those played their parts. The answer is closer to a chemical reaction. Money without purpose corrodes the people who hold it, and a fortune built on selling nothing above a dime could not buy its heirs a reason to exist. That's the thesis this story will prove, not through argument, but through evidence. The nickels, the tower, the dead mother, the 7 husbands, and the slow, almost voluntary dissolution of $50 million across 5 decades until a woman who'd once thrown a party for 2,000 guests couldn't afford her own phone bill. But before the dissolution, there was the building, and before the building, there was the arithmetic. Frank Winfield Woolworth was born in 1852 in Rodman, New York, a town so small and so agricultural that the nearest thing to a retail education was watching his mother barter eggs for dry goods at a general store. He grew up milking cows and hauling water, and by his own later admission, he hated every minute of it. What he wanted was a life in commerce. What he got at first was a series of low-wage clerkships in which his employers uniformly noted that he was terrible with customers. He couldn't charm, he couldn't haggle, and he couldn't perform the theatrical persuasion that 19th century retail demanded of its countermen. This failure was the making of him. Because Frank Woolworth looked at a system built on personal salesmanship and negotiated pricing and asked a question so simple it bordered on subversive. What if the goods sold themselves? What if you took every item out from behind the counter, put it on an open table where people could touch it, and fixed the price so low that no persuasion was needed? He got his chance in February 1879 in Utica, New York, where he opened a store that sold nothing above 5 cents. The concept was sound, but the location was terrible. Within weeks, the store was hemorrhaging money, and Woolworth closed it before spring. Most people would have read that as a verdict. Woolworth read it as a data point. The mechanism worked because people bought when you made it easy. The problem was foot traffic, not philosophy. 4 months later, in June 1879, he opened a second store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with one critical adjustment. He added a 10-cent line alongside the 5-cent goods. This time, the store thrived. Not because Lancaster was richer than Utica, or because the merchandise was better. It thrived because Woolworth had found the formula's missing variable. A nickel alone limited your inventory too severely. But a dime opened the range just enough to stock goods people actually needed. Household items, small tools, ribbons, soap, while keeping the price so low that buying felt frictionless. No deliberation, no guilt, just a dime on the counter and the item in your hand. That was the nickel arithmetic. The phrase sounds quaint, like something from a children's book about thrift. But the math behind it was ruthless. Woolworth understood something that most merchants of his era refused to accept. The profit wasn't in the margin, it was in the volume. If you made 2 cents on a 10-cent item, you needed to sell that item 500 times to make $10. So you needed 500 customers, which meant a location with foot traffic, which meant a storefront on a busy street, with a bright red facade, with the merchandise visible from the sidewalk. And then you needed another storefront, and another, and another. He bought directly from manufacturers, cutting out wholesalers. He ordered in quantities so large that suppliers gave him prices no competitor could match. Then he replicated, every store identical, every counter laid out the same way, every price fixed, every item touchable, every clerk interchangeable. It wasn't retail, it was a system. And systems scale in ways that individual talent never can. By 1911, when the F.W. Woolworth Company incorporated, the chain operated 586 stores. By the time Frank died in 1919, the number exceeded 1,000. 1,000 storefronts, each one turning pennies into dollars, and all those dollars flowing upward into the hands of a man who'd started with nothing but an insight about human nature. People will buy what they can touch, at a price that doesn't make them think. He was brilliant. There's no other word for it. The 5 and dime wasn't just a store format. It was a thesis about democracy and desire, about making consumption available to people who'd never been courted as customers before. The working poor, the immigrants, the women who managed household budgets down to the last cent. Woolworth saw them, understood them, and built an empire by serving them. In return, they made him one of the richest men in America. But here's what the nickel arithmetic could not teach: what to do with the money once you had it. Woolworth knew how to make a fortune. He had no idea how to make a family that could survive one. The same single-minded intensity that let him replicate a store format across a continent left him with almost no capacity for the human work of raising children who understood what the money meant, where it came from, what it cost the people who earned it. He gave his daughters wealth. He did not give them purpose, and purpose, it turned out, was the only thing the money couldn't buy. That gap between the fortune and the family, between the system and the soul, is where this story lives. The nickels multiplied, the tower rose, and the family cracked open like something hollow struck too hard. The Woolworth building's opening in April 1913 was designed as spectacle, and it delivered. Cass Gilbert, the architect Woolworth had commissioned, created something that belonged more to medieval Europe than to modern Manhattan. The lobby alone, with its vaulted mosaic ceilings and marble walls, justified the building's nickname, the Cathedral of Commerce. And Gilbert, perhaps with a sense of humour, perhaps with a sense of prophecy, carved caricatures into the lobby's stone. One of them depicted Frank Woolworth himself hunched over, counting his nickels and dimes, a stone monument to small change, rising higher than any other structure on Earth. Woolworth wanted the building to serve as advertising, a giant signboard, he called it, visible from the harbour, from Brooklyn, from the Jersey Shore. His company's headquarters occupied only about a floor and a half of the 60-story tower. The rest was leased to tenants. The building was both monument and investment, vanity and pragmatism fused in Gothic stone. That fusion was pure Woolworth. Every grand gesture contained a practical calculation. Every romantic impulse was underwritten by the nickel arithmetic. 80,000 bulbs lit simultaneously by presidential signal. The press covered it like a coronation. And Frank Woolworth stood at the centre of it, 61 years old, the farm boy made titan watching his name blaze in electric light above lower Manhattan. It was the peak, the absolute apex of a life built on multiplication. But peaks are where the cracks start. In 1907, 6 years before the tower opened, Woolworth's daughter Edna had married a man named Franklin Hutton. Hutton was a stockbroker, handsome, well-connected, and possessed of a wandering eye that would prove disastrous. The marriage was troubled almost from the start. Hutton's infidelities were persistent and poorly concealed. Edna, trapped in a gilded cage of her father's money and her husband's indifference, deteriorated. She was 33 years old in May of 1917 when she died in a New York hotel suite. The official cause was mastoiditis, an ear infection gone septic. But persistent reports, never confirmed and never fully silenced, suggest she took her own life by poison. What is confirmed is this: Barbara Hutton, 4 years old, was in the suite when her mother died. Whether she found the body, as some accounts claim, or was simply present in the adjacent room, the fact remains that a child too young to understand death was nonetheless close enough to smell it. That proximity, That early collision with loss and silence and adult failure would shadow Barbara Hutton for the rest of her life, and the fortune that was supposed to protect her, to insulate her from the world's roughness, instead became the instrument of her destruction. But that story comes later. In 1917, what mattered to the outside world was that Frank Woolworth's granddaughter was now motherless, and that her inheritance was growing. Her mother's estate alone was worth roughly $8 million. Her grandfather's empire continued to expand. The nickel arithmetic kept compounding. The money piled up around a child who had no way to understand what it was or where it came from. Frank Woolworth himself had only 2 years left. He died in 1919, his body worn out at 66, his mind clouded by dental infections he'd refused to treat because he was terrified of dentists. The man who built an empire on rational systems and relentless efficiency died of irrational fear, a small irony that the universe provided free of charge. And here's the foil that makes the nickel arithmetic sting. While Woolworth was paying $13.5 million in cash for his cathedral, while his architect was carving those whimsical caricatures into the lobby stone, the women who worked behind the counters in his stores earned wages that barely covered room and board. They worked 6-day weeks. They stood on their feet for 10 hours at a stretch. The 5 and dime promised affordable goods to the working poor, and it delivered that promise on the backs of working poor employees. The system was elegant, but it was not kind. This is not to say Woolworth was uniquely cruel. He wasn't. He was typical of his era, a Gilded Age employer who saw labour as a cost to be minimised, not a constituency to be served. But the contrast matters for what comes next, because when Barbara Hutton inherited her $50 million in 1933, at the absolute bottom of the Great Depression, the bread lines forming outside Woolworth stores were staffed by people whose labour had built the very fortune now landing in the lap of a 21-year-old socialite. The adjacency of those two facts, the millions and the bread lines, the heiress and the counter girls, would haunt Barbara for the rest of her life. The press would make sure of it. They called her the poor little rich girl. The phrase was meant as mockery, but it turned out to be prophecy, because Barbara Hutton was poor in every way that money couldn't fix. Poor in parental love, poor in self-knowledge, poor in the practical skills that come from having to earn your own way. The fortune arrived without instructions, without purpose, without any mechanism for transforming wealth into meaning. Frank Woolworth had his stores. He had the problem of scale, the challenge of replication, the daily puzzle of supply and demand. The money was a byproduct of work he found genuinely absorbing. His granddaughter had nothing but the byproduct. The work was gone, the purpose was gone, and all that remained was the cash. Cash, it turns out, is not a foundation. It's a solvent. The tower still stands at 203 Broadway. Tourists photograph it, architecture students study it, and the lobby's mosaics gleam under careful restoration. If you look closely at the carved stone figures in that lobby, you can still find Frank Woolworth, frozen in caricature, counting his dimes. He looks pleased with himself, and he should. He built something extraordinary from something small, but the question that hangs over this story, the question that will carry us through 7 marriages and 5 decades of dissolution, is whether the thing he built was ever transferable, whether a fortune rooted in purpose, in the daily discipline of nickel arithmetic, can survive the transition to people who never learned the arithmetic, who never stood behind a counter, who never opened a store in a bad location and had to figure out why it failed. Frank Woolworth knew why his Utica store failed. He adjusted, he tried again, and he built Lancaster. He built an empire. His granddaughter would never experience that cycle of failure and correction because the money insulated her from consequence. And insulation from consequence, it turns out, is not a gift. It's a slow-acting poison. The foundation of the Woolworth building goes down to bedrock. It was engineered to last centuries. The foundation of the Woolworth fortune went down only as far as one man's obsessive competence. When that man died, the money remained, but the competence, the purpose, the daily discipline of selling nothing above a dime, all of that was gone. What remained was a 4-year-old girl in a hotel suite, a growing trust fund, and a name carved in stone on the tallest building in the world. The money was about to enter its 2nd generation, and the 2nd generation had already begun to bleed. The Plaza Hotel on the morning of May 2, 1917 was doing what the Plaza always did. Bellmen moved trunks through the lobby. cut flowers were being arranged in the Palm Court. Fifth Avenue outside was thick with motorcars and hansom cabs, and the war in Europe was on every front page, though the war had not yet reached this particular block. On the 5th floor, in a corner suite the Hutton family kept as their New York residence, a 33-year-old woman lay dead on the bed. She was wearing, according to the accounts that have come down to us, a white lace dress embroidered with gold irises and a double strand of pearls at her throat. She had dressed for something. What she had dressed for, no one who could answer is left to ask. Edna Woolworth Hutton was Frank Woolworth's middle daughter. She had grown up in the Fifth Avenue mansion her father built to announce the family's arrival among people who were not sure they wanted the family to arrive. She had married Franklin Laws Hutton in 1907, a stockbroker with a fine profile and a finer opinion of himself, and she had produced one child, a daughter named Barbara, born in November of 1912. By the spring of 1917, the marriage was ash. Franklin's infidelities were not discreet. They were the kind of infidelities that turn up in gossip columns, that are known to the staff, that a wife hears about from friends who are hoping to be the ones to tell her first. Edna had spent the previous winter in a state that biographers, working from letters and the recollections of household servants, describe as a slow collapse. What happened in that suite on the morning of May 2nd has never been settled, and it will not be settled here. The official cause of death was recorded as suffocation, brought on by mastoiditis, a chronic infection of the bone behind the ear that could, in the era before antibiotics, prove fatal. That is what the coroner wrote, what the family said, and what the newspapers reported in the small and respectful notices that a Woolworth death commanded. But the record around Edna's death has holes in it that a family of ordinary means could not have produced. No autopsy was performed. The coroner declared one unnecessary. When reporters later attempted to retrieve the case files, they were told the files had been misplaced. They have never been recovered. Biographers working the story over the following decades, drawing on servants' accounts, on Franklin's own indiscretions in later years, on the medical improbability of the stated cause, arrived at a different conclusion. Strychnine, most of them concluded. Self-administered, a wife who had run out of alternatives. The Woolworth family had money, and money in New York in 1917 could purchase the shape of a story. It could purchase a coroner's discretion. It could purchase the disappearance of a file. It could purchase the polite fiction that a young mother in a lace dress had been carried off by an ear infection in a 5th-floor suite of the finest hotel in the city. What it could not purchase was the child. Barbara Hutton was 4 years old. She was in the suite that morning. The accounts vary on exactly what she saw and when she saw it. Some have a maid discovering the body first and the child following. Others place Barbara alone in the room with her mother, calling for her, waiting for her to answer. The precise choreography of that morning is beyond recovery. What is not beyond recovery is the fact that a 4-year-old girl was inside the walls of that suite when her mother died, and that she remained inside those walls for some interval of time that no one who loved her thought to shorten. She saw the dress, and she saw the pearls, and she saw whatever expression her mother's face had settled into. She was old enough to remember, but too young to understand. There is a temptation in telling a story like this, to draw a straight line from that room to every marriage that followed, every pill, every bottle, every check written to a man who was going to leave. The line is too straight. Barbara Hutton was not the sum of one morning at the plaza, but the morning was inside her, and it did not leave. She would spend the rest of her life in hotel suites. She would die in a hotel suite. She would surround herself for 62 more years with rooms that resembled the one she could not walk out of. The suite was closed up, the funeral was small, and Franklin Hutton, whose behaviour had authored the collapse, was named guardian of his daughter's person, though not, mercifully, of her fortune. That went into trust. Edna's share of the Woolworth wealth, augmented by what would flow to Barbara from her grandmother's estate and in time from her grandfather's, was placed under the management of trustees who were instructed to grow it. They did. They grew it through the 20s, through the boom, through the years when Barbara was passed among relatives in boarding schools and European tutors, when she was photographed at children's parties in dresses that cost more than a shopgirl earned in a year, when she developed the habit, which never left her, of giving away her possessions to people who admired them, as though possessions were the only currency she had been taught to use. She grew up rich in a very particular way. Not rich the way old money was rich, with land and duty and the assumption that you would take a seat on a board somewhere and marry someone your parents had already met. Rich the way new money was rich when the newness had curdled. Her grandfather's competence was 2 generations behind her, filtered through trustees and lawyers and the sound of adding machines in offices she would never enter. Her father was a presence and an absence at once. Her mother was a story told in lowered voices. She had every governess, every language master, every riding instructor money could summon, and she had nothing that resembled a home. In December of 1930, 3 years before the full weight of the fortune would land on her, Barbara Hutton was introduced to New York society at a debutante ball her father threw at the Ritz-Carlton. The country outside the ballroom was in the second year of the Depression. Unemployment was climbing toward a quarter of the workforce. In the Woolworth stores across the country, sales were holding up better than at most retailers, because a nation in ruin still needed thread and soap and cheap tin toys for Christmas. But the counter girls behind those counters were watching their neighbours lose homes and were grateful, in the grim way of the era, to have a job at all. Inside the Ritz-Carlton, on the night of Barbara's debut, 4 orchestras played in rotation so the music would never stop. 2,000 bottles of champagne were opened. The guests were given, as party favours, small jewellery cases containing unmounted precious stones, gems the size of a fingernail, to be set later according to the taste of the recipient. The ball reportedly cost around $60,000, a figure that translates, in the money of a later century, to something over $1 million. The average annual wage of a Woolworth counter girl at that moment was around $450. One night of Barbara's debut, in raw arithmetic, consumed roughly 130 years of a counter girl's labour. The girls did not know. The girls were not invited. The girls were, in that same week, standing on their feet for 10 hours behind the counters that had paid for the champagne. The papers covered the ball. They covered it enthusiastically because a ball in the middle of a depression was the kind of story that sold copy on both sides of the resentment. The society pages ran the dress and the flowers and the guest list. The tabloids ran the arithmetic. And somewhere in the space between those 2 coverages, the phrase attached itself to her and would not come off. Poor little rich girl. It began as a caption, then became a headline, and became, eventually, the name the country used for her, so that a whole generation of Americans could not hear the words Barbara Hutton without hearing the mockery attached. She was 18. She had not spent the money. She had not chosen the ball. Her father had chosen it, in the manner of a man who understood display better than he understood daughters. But the country did not care who had chosen it. The country saw a girl in a white dress being handed the world at a moment when the world was being taken from everyone else, and the country decided how it felt about her. It would never quite change its mind. 3 years later, in November of 1933, she turned 21, and the trusts began to release. The exact figure has been argued for 90 years. Some accounts put the inheritance at $42 million. Some put it at 50. The variance depends on which assets are counted, which trusts had matured, and what the depressed markets of that year were doing to the paper valuations. The order of magnitude is not in dispute. She came into somewhere between $40 and $50 million in 1933 currency, at an age when most people are still learning to balance a checkbook. To render that figure honestly, hold it against what was happening outside her window. In 1933, the unemployment rate in the United States reached roughly 1 in 4 working adults. Bread lines wrapped city blocks. In Detroit, in Chicago, in Pittsburgh, families were being turned out of homes at a rate that overwhelmed the shelters set up to receive them. The Woolworth stores, more than 1,500 of them by that year, were among the last commercial spaces where the truly broke could still enter without shame, because a dime was a dime, and a child could still buy a wooden top or a paper doll and feel, for a moment, that the world had not entirely stopped. The stores were doing their work. They were doing the work Frank Woolworth built them to do. Outside those stores, in the same weeks that Barbara's trustees were signing the paperwork that released her fortune, bread lines formed. Some of the bread lines formed on the same sidewalks as the Woolworth storefronts. The counter girls on their breaks could see the men in the lines through the windows. The men in the lines could see the counter girls. And in a Fifth Avenue townhouse and a suite at the Ritz, and a stateroom on a liner bound for France, a 21-year-old woman with no work, no husband, no living mother, and no clear idea what to do with a morning, was informed by her lawyers that she was now, on paper, one of the wealthiest women on earth. She left the country. That was the first thing she did. She left for Europe, where the Depression was a rumour, and where a young American heiress with an untraceable amount of money in her name was the most attractive proposition on the continent. The princes were waiting. They had been waiting, in a sense, since the day she was born. Titled European families, cash poor and title rich, had been marrying American money for 2 generations by then. The pattern was well established. What was different about Barbara was the scale. There had never been an American heiress quite this rich, quite this young, and quite this unmoored. The first one was a Georgian prince named Alexis Mdivani. The Mdivanis were a family of siblings out of the collapsed Russian imperial fringe. 3 brothers and 2 sisters who had made a specialty of marrying rich Americans. The press, which had already found its handle on Barbara, now found its handle on the brothers, the marrying Mdivanis. Alexis was handsome in the specific way that titled men from vanished empires tended to be handsome, which is to say that the handsomeness came with a bill attached. Barbara married him in Paris in the summer of 1933. She was 20. The settlement she paid him on their divorce, less than 2 years later, ran into the millions, and he walked away with a fortune of his own carved out of hers. He died in a car crash not long after. The pattern was set. Before the ink was dry on the Mdivani divorce, she married a Danish count named Kurt von Haugwitz Reventlow. This one produced a son, Lance, born in 1936, and a marriage that biographers describe with the flat vocabulary reserved for domestic violence. Reventlow was, by the accounts of household staff and later court filings, physically abusive. The marriage ended in 1938 in a custody fight that spilled across 2 countries and generated headlines that read, "Even now, like a warning." Barbara kept the boy. Reventlow kept a substantial slice of the fortune. She was 26 years old, and she had already been married twice, and the press had begun to keep score in a way that no ordinary person's marriages are ever scored. The third one was Cary Grant. This is the marriage everyone remembers, because Cary Grant is the only name in the ledger that still means something to a general audience, and because the marriage was the closest thing to an ordinary love story in the entire sequence. They married in 1942. The press, which had learned to name these things, called them Cash and Carry. The name was cruel to both of them, and only accurate about one. Grant, by every serious account, did not need her money and did not take it. When they divorced in 1945, he refused a settlement. He asked for nothing. He walked away with the same bank account he had walked in with, which made him, in the ledger of Barbara Hutton's marriages, the outlier that proves the rule. The rule was that the men billed her. Grant did not bill her. Grant, in the end, seems to have been the one husband who tried, briefly, to see the woman rather than the estate. It did not save the marriage. Nothing was going to save the marriage. But it saved his name from the ledger of extraction that the other 6 husbands wrote themselves into. After Grant came a Russian prince named Igor Trubetskoy, married in 1947. He had less money than any of the previous husbands and by some accounts more genuine feeling. The marriage failed anyway, and Barbara attempted suicide during the collapse of it. She survived. The divorce settled in 1951, bringing another prince, another settlement, another set of headlines. She was 38 years old and the ledger was still open. Then came the marriage that broke even the tabloid's capacity for arithmetic. In December of 1953, Barbara Hutton married Porfirio Rubirosa. Rubirosa was a Dominican playboy, a former diplomat, a polo player, a man whose reputation with women had reached the point where his name functioned in the international press as shorthand for a particular kind of predatory charm. He was already famous for having married and drained a previous American heiress, and Barbara knew this. Everyone knew this. She married him anyway. The marriage lasted 53 days. In those 53 days, according to the accounting that later emerged, Rubirosa extracted from her something on the order of $2.5 million in cash, plus jewellery, plus a string of polo ponies, plus, in the detail that has kept the story alive for 70 years, a converted B-25 bomber aircraft, a wartime bomber as a parting gift. Consider that transaction without softening it. A woman handed a man a military aircraft as compensation for staying married to her for less than 2 months, and he took it. He flew away in it. The comparison the arithmetic invites is almost too obscene to render, but it should be rendered. The average American family in 1953 earned around $4,000 a year. Rubirosa left the marriage with a settlement equal to over 600 years of that family's income, and then he left with an airplane on top. She was 41 years old. She'd been married 5 times. The fortune, which had entered her life at $50 million, had been chewed on for 20 years by lawyers, husbands, staff, decorators, jewellers, and the simple compounding weight of a lifestyle that recognised no ceiling. The trustees were still there. The dividends from the Woolworth holdings were still arriving. The stores were still selling nothing above a dime, or, by the 50s, nothing above the slightly higher price points the chain had grudgingly adopted. The machine that Frank Woolworth had built was still running, still profitable, still throwing off cash, but the cash was flowing out of the account faster than it was flowing in, and for the first time, the trustees began to make sounds that suggested the arithmetic was no longer infinite. 2 more marriages remained. A German tennis champion named Baron Gottfried von Kram, whom she married in 1955 and divorced in 1959, in a union that further thinned the assets without producing headlines quite as lurid as Rubirosa's. And finally, in 1964, a Vietnamese Laotian chemist to whom she paid, according to the accounts, for the acquisition of a princely title he could then hand back to her in marriage. Prince Pierre Daune. That marriage ended in 1966. She was 54 years old, she had been married 7 times, and she had inherited one of the largest personal fortunes in American history. The men who had passed through her life had, between them, walked away with settlements, gifts, jewels, aircraft, ponies, and enough working capital to found small nations. The tabloids, for their part, had stopped bothering to count. The joke had gone on too long. The poor little rich girl was now a poor little middle-aged woman, and the country's appetite for her had shifted from mockery to something closer to pity, and then to the thing that comes after pity, which is a bored looking away. She was still rich, on paper. She was still, in 1966, capable of writing checks that would have set up an ordinary family for life. But the trajectory was clear, the account was draining, and the trustees were exhausted. The woman at the centre of it, the 4-year-old girl who had once stood in a room at the plaza and looked at a lace dress embroidered with gold irises, was now moving between hotel suites with a retinue that grew smaller each year, and a habit for pills and champagne that grew larger. The husbands were only the visible drain. Behind them, running beneath them, larger than any of them, was something harder to see and harder to stop. The fortune was not merely being taken, it was being dissolved from within, by the daily arithmetic of a life that had never learned to say no to itself and had never been given a reason to try. The daily arithmetic was this: staff in multiple residences, even as the residences shrank. Personal secretaries, maids, cooks, drivers, companions whose job title was simply friend, and whose invoices arrived monthly. Doctors who prescribed what she asked for. Lawyers who managed the collapsing architecture of trusts and settlements. Jewellers who still extended credit because the name still carried weight, even as the account behind it thinned. And gifts. Gifts that never stopped, because generosity was the one behaviour that still produced warmth from other human beings, and warmth was the thing she could not stop purchasing. She gave away money to people she barely knew. She funded parties she did not attend. She bought houses for staff members, paid school fees for their children, settled debts for acquaintances who appeared at her door with a story and left with a cheque. The impulse was not evil. It might even have been the most human thing about her. But it operated without a flaw, without a threshold below which the giving would trigger some protective reflex, and the people around her had no incentive to install one. This is the shape of the dissipation, and it needs to be understood not as a single catastrophe, but as a slow tide going out. There was no moment when Barbara Hutton lost her fortune. There was no embezzlement trial, no market crash that wiped her out overnight, no single betrayal dramatic enough to carry a headline. The money left the way, water leaves a basin with a crack in it, steadily and silently, while no one with the authority to plug the crack had any reason to do so, because the people closest to the crack were the ones drinking from it. By the late 1960s, the retinue had contracted, but it had not disappeared. She moved between hotel suites, the same mode of living that had surrounded her since childhood, since the room at the plaza where everything began. Hotels were the only architecture she knew how to inhabit. A house required decisions about maintenance, about neighbours, about belonging to a place. A hotel required only money. You arrived, you attended to, you left. The transaction was clean, and if you stayed long enough, if you became a permanent guest, the hotel itself became a kind of cocoon, a place where nothing was demanded of you except payment, and where the walls asked no questions about what you were doing with your life. She was asking herself no questions either. The pills, by this point, were not recreational. They were structural. Seconal to sleep, dexedrine to wake, champagne to bridge the hours between. Her weight dropped. Her bones became fragile. She fell more than once, and the falls broke things that healed slowly or not at all. The woman who had once been photographed at embassy balls in Paris, in jade and diamonds, in furs that cost more than the houses of the women who sewed them, was now a figure that room service attendants recognised by the smallness of her frame and the size of her tips. And then, in 1972, the one thing happened that even money could not have prevented, and that the absence of money made no worse and no better. Her son, Lance Reventlow, died. He was 36. A private plane crash in Aspen, Colorado. He was her only child, the son from her second marriage, and he was the single thread that still connected her to something outside herself. Lance had his own troubles, his own trust fund, his own attempts to build purpose out of inherited wealth. He had raced cars, built them, tried to compete at Le Mans. He had married and divorced. He was, in his own way, running the same experiment his mother was running, trying to find out whether money could become a reason to get up in the morning if you aimed it at something specific enough. The plane crash ended the experiment. After Lance's death, Barbara Hutton withdrew. That word, withdrew, is doing more work than it appears to. She did not retreat to a country house. She did not enter a facility. She withdrew the way a snail withdraws into its shell. Except the shell was a hotel suite, and the suite kept changing cities because even permanence required more energy than she could muster. Tangier for a while, where she had once kept a palace and a small court of artists and expatriates. Then Los Angeles. Then finally the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, which would become the last room. The people who remained around her in those final years, the mid to late 1970s, were few. Some were genuinely loyal, some were simply still on salary. The distinction between the two had collapsed years earlier because in a life where every relationship is mediated by money, loyalty and employment become the same gesture. You cannot tell the difference between someone who loves you and someone who is paid to be present, because being present is the only form that love takes in a hotel suite, and payment is the only mechanism that produces presence. The trustees by this point had largely given up. The Woolworth company itself was still operating, still profitable, but the connection between the company's dividends and Barbara's spending had been severed years earlier. The trust distributions were no longer sufficient to cover the outflow. Capital was being liquidated. Jewellery was being sold, piece by piece. The collection that had once been among the finest private holdings in the world, now feeding the monthly bills like timber into a furnace. The Hutton Madivani Jadid necklace, the ropes of pearls, the diamond tiaras, each one represented not just monetary value, but a specific memory, a specific husband, a specific era of her life, and each one left her possession without ceremony. Sold at auction, or sold privately, or simply handed to a creditor in lieu of cash. The biography of a fortune, written in gemstones, being dismantled chapter by chapter. No court intervened. No government agency stepped in to declare her incompetent or to freeze her assets. No family member, because there were no family members left withstanding, filed a petition. The law, in its wisdom, does not prevent a competent adult from spending her own money, even if the spending is self-destructive, even if the competence is debatable, even if the pills and the champagne and the isolation suggest that the decisions being made are not decisions at all, but simply the continuation of a pattern that no one has ever interrupted. This is the reckoning as anticlimax. The fortune does not end in a courtroom. It ends in a series of monthly statements that get smaller, a series of rooms that get quieter, and a series of phone calls that stop being returned. By 1978, she was living almost entirely in bed. Her weight was below 90 pounds. The champagne continued, and so did the pills. The staff had shrunk to a handful, the visitors to fewer still. The tabloids had moved on decades ago. The poor little rich girl headline had been retired in the 1950s, and no one had coined a replacement because no one was paying attention. America had found newer, louder stories about wealth and waste, and Barbara Hutton had become invisible in the way that only the formerly famous can become invisible, which is completely. She died on May 11, 1979 at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. She was 66 years old. Her bank account, according to the consistent reports of every biographer who has examined the estate, held approximately $3,500. That figure needs no comparison to land. You already know what 50 million looks like against 3,500. You already know how many husbands, how many settlements, how many hotel suites, how many pills, how many silent evenings it took to close that distance. The arithmetic is 46 years long, and it arrived at a number that would not have covered the funeral. About 16 people attended that funeral. 16. For a woman whose debutante ball had drawn 1,000. For a woman whose weddings had filled cathedrals. For a woman whose name had once been printed in newspapers more often than the president's. 16 people stood in a room and marked the end of Barbara Hutton's life, and then they left, and the name went quiet. But the name did not disappear entirely, because the name is not only on the woman, the name is on the building. The Woolworth building stands at 203 Broadway, in Lower Manhattan. It has stood there since 1913. It stood there when Frank Woolworth pressed the button and 80,000 bulbs lit the sky. It stood there when his daughter Edna died at the plaza in a lace dress. It stood there when his granddaughter Barbara turned 21 and collected $50 million at the bottom of the Depression. It stood there through 7 weddings and 7 dissolutions. It stood there when Lance Raventlow's plane went down in Aspen. It stood there when Barbara's bank account crossed below 4 figures for the last time. It stands there now. The lobby remains. Cass Gilbert's cruciform design, the vaulted ceilings, the gold glass mosaics, the stained glass skylights, and the carved stone caricatures, Frank Woolworth, rendered in limestone counting his dimes, the architect holding a miniature of the tower he made. These figures look down on the lobby today the same way they looked down on it in 1913. They don't age, they don't spend, they don't marry badly or take pills or move between hotel suites looking for someone who will stay without being paid. The Witkoff Group purchased the building in 1998 for $155 million. No Woolworth descendant was involved in the transaction. No Woolworth descendant held any claim to the structure. The connection between the family and the tower had been severed decades earlier, dissolved in the same slow tide that dissolved everything else. The building passed out of the family's orbit the way the jewellery had passed out of Barbara's hands, without ceremony, without drama, simply as a consequence of arithmetic that no one had managed to reverse. The Reverend S. Parks Cadman called it the Cathedral of Commerce when it opened. The name stuck because it was accurate. Frank Woolworth built a cathedral to the 5 and dime, to the idea that a man who sold nothing above 10 cents could, through repetition and discipline and the relentless compounding of small transactions, accumulate enough capital to pay cash for the tallest structure on earth. The building was the proof. The building was the sermon. And the sermon said, purpose, applied daily, compounds into permanence. His granddaughter received the fortune without the sermon. She received the money without the discipline that made it, without the repetition that sustained it, without the daily act of opening a store and selling something to someone who needed it. She received a number disconnected from its source, and she spent 46 years looking for something the number could become. It became husbands, jewellery, hotel suites and pills and champagne and gifts to strangers, and a kindness that had no flaw beneath it. It became, in the end, $3,500 and a room where 16 people said goodbye. The tower still catches the afternoon light. The gold mosaics still glow in the lobby. The carved figure of Frank Woolworth still counts his dimes, patient, unhurried, permanent as the stone he's cut from. A man who sold nothing above a dime built something that outlasted everything his money touched. The fortune moved through 3 generations in 60 years and left nothing behind except the building he paid for before any of them were born. It stands on Broadway, in the early dark of a winter afternoon, and the lobby is quiet and the name is on the facade, and no one who bears that name will ever walk through the door again.